Welcome back, deep dive listener. Today we're going to be diving into the world of Wikipedia. You know, that online encyclopedia we all rely on, but maybe don't always think about too deeply. Have you ever wondered what keeps that massive project going? Is it just a free-for-all, or are there hidden forces shaping how knowledge grows on Wikipedia?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers have actually studied.
You've sent us this fascinating research paper, and it's a mouthful: Externalities in Knowledge Production, evidence from a randomized field experiment.
Yes, academics do love their jargon.
But for those of us who aren't economists, what does externalities actually mean in this context?
It basically means how one person's actions can have a ripple effect on others. In this case, they were looking at how adding information to Wikipedia might influence whether other people contribute to those same articles.
Okay, that makes sense. So instead of just theorizing, these researchers designed a real-world experiment to see what happens when you add information to Wikipedia. Paint me a picture. What did this experiment actually look like?
So imagine this. They focused on Wikipedia articles about 60 medium-sized Spanish cities. But here's the twist. These articles were in the French, German, and Italian versions of Wikipedia. They specifically chose these articles because they were relatively short and incomplete compared to their Spanish counterparts.
Ah, so they saw an opportunity, like a knowledge gap they could fill.
Exactly. They randomly chose half of these city articles and added a couple of paragraphs worth of information and a picture, all pulled from the more detailed Spanish and English versions. Think of it like giving half of these articles a little boost.
So they set the stage, added some linguistic flair, and then what? Did they just sit back and watch the magic happen?
Precisely. They monitored these articles over the next 4 years. They were curious to see if adding that extra information would spark more contributions from other editors.
4 years is a long time to wait for results. What did they find? Did adding information have the desired effect?
Well, the results were intriguing, to say the least. In the first 2 years, things seemed promising.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So there's an initial spark of engagement. What happens next?
They noticed a noticeable increase in edits and people contributing to the articles that got the extra information compared to the ones that didn't.
So far, so good, right?
Yeah.
Adding information does seem to get people more engaged, but I'm guessing there's more to the story.
You're right, there's a fascinating twist. To really understand what was going on, the researchers dug deeper into the types of edits being made. They found that most of the extra activity was focused on polishing the newly added content itself.
So instead of adding their own unique insights or expanding on different aspects of the city, people were mostly focused on refining what was already there.
Exactly. It was like they were fact-checking and refining the new additions rather than going off on their own tangents.
That's interesting. It's like they were fact-checking and refining the new additions rather than going off on their own tangents. Does that tell us anything about how people engage with new knowledge?
That's a great question and something we can explore further. It does make you wonder what motivates people to contribute their own knowledge versus building on what others have already shared.
So we've got this initial burst of activity focused on refining what's already there. What happens in the long run? Did those articles that got the information boost end up significantly longer or richer after 4 years?
That's where it gets really interesting. After 4 years, the articles that got that initial boost were basically the same length as those that didn't. That initial bump in contributions, it faded away.
Wow, so it's like a sugar rush.
Yeah.
A quick burst of energy and then poof, it's gone. You'd think that more information would lead to even more information, like a snowball effect.
You'd think so, right? It's intuitive to assume that if you provide more building blocks, people will naturally build something even bigger and better.
Right, like adding more books to a library will inspire more people to read and write their own.
Exactly. But this research suggests that it's not always that simple. Simply dumping more information into the void might not be the most effective strategy for long-term growth.
So what's the takeaway here? Should we just give up on trying to add information to places like Wikipedia?
Not at all. It just means we need to be more strategic and thoughtful about how we approach knowledge sharing. Remember how we talked about externalities earlier?
Right, how one person's actions can influence others.
Exactly. This research suggests that just focusing on the quantity of information might not be enough to create those positive ripple effects. Perhaps the quality of the information and how it's presented matters even more.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between throwing a bunch of ingredients together and hoping for the best versus carefully crafting a recipe.
Precisely. Think about it this way. If you walked into a library with books strewn about haphazardly, would you be inspired to sit down and read? Or would you feel overwhelmed and walk out?
Definitely overwhelmed. I need a well-organized library, a comfy chair, maybe even a cup of tea, to really get lost in a good book.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment that invites exploration and contribution, not one that overwhelms people with a jumbled mess of information.
So instead of just focusing on adding information, maybe it's about cultivating knowledge. But how do we apply this to our own lives? Not all of us are Wikipedia editors.
That's a great point, and it's something we can all relate to. Think about any time you've been part of a project or a team. Simply having more information doesn't guarantee success, does it? It's about how that information is used, shared, and built upon.
You're right. I've definitely been in meetings where we were drowning in data, but no one knew what to do with it. It was overwhelming and ultimately unproductive.
Yeah.
So how do we move from a place of information overload to one of meaningful knowledge creation?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something we'll explore further after a quick break.
So we've been talking about how simply having more information doesn't necessarily lead to more engagement or deeper understandings, like that old saying, information overload, knowledge starvation.
Exactly. And that's the challenge we're facing today, isn't it? We're bombarded with information from all sides, but turning that raw material into something meaningful, something we can actually use, that's the real trick.
Absolutely. So go back to the Wikipedia study. Are there any other clues about how we can move beyond just accumulating information and towards a more collaborative knowledge building approach?
Well, there are a couple of really interesting nuances in the research I think that are worth highlighting. First, it's important to remember that this particular study focused on Wikipedia articles that were already relatively well developed.
Right. These weren't brand new pages with tons of missing information.
Exactly. So it's possible that adding information to a brand new article or one that's still in its early stages might have a different effect. It's like the difference between adding a seed to a freshly tilled garden versus trying to plant something in a dense, overgrown forest.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
The impact of that initial contribution might be much greater when there's more space for it to grow.
Precisely. And here's another intriguing finding. The researchers found some evidence suggesting that adding information might have a bigger impact on articles that were initially of lower quality.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about the stage of development, but also the quality of the existing information.
Right. It's like adding a fertilizer to a struggling plant might give it a much needed boost, whereas a plant that's already thriving might not show much difference.
This is really making me rethink how I approach sharing and engaging with information. It's not enough to just throw information out there and hope for the best.
Mm.
We need to be more mindful about context quality and creating environments where knowledge can truly flourish.
I couldn't agree more. It's about shifting from a mindset of information consumption to one of active knowledge creation. It's about being curious, asking questions, connecting the dots, and not being afraid to contribute our own unique perspectives.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you, listener. Instead of just passively consuming information, how can you be a more active participant in shaping the knowledge landscape around you? Thanks for diving deep with us.